The Incredibles is Pixar's most brutally honest film. It does not sugarcoat things. It does not try to hide some of the uglier aspects of society from its audience. It does not pull any punches. And yet, The Incredibles does not come off as an overly grim, pessimistic, or terrifying film. I can't think of many people who would characterize it in that way as a whole. Many would actually characterize it as being one of Pixar's most fun and action-packed examples. It's a movie about people with superpowers after all. The Incredibles is a masterclass in how a family-friendly film can be brutally honest with its audience without damaging its overall tone. I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of unhappy characters in The Incredibles. The entire first act is centered around how each member of the Parr family feels unsatisfied and unfulfilled in their existence. Well, except for Jack Jack. He's okay. It's somewhat unusual for Pixar's output in how, after the opening set piece, the whole world immediately dumps on all of the characters. All of them. It's not like Brave, where the father and brother characters are fine. It's not like Toy Story, where it's just Woody who hates Buzz. The Incredibles doesn't wait for the classic end of Act 2 sad point. It drops all of the characters into a pit almost immediately. Act 1 is successful in making each of the four characters both sympathetic and relatable. This is obviously part of the film's special sauce, the fact that it revolves around a family that different people in the audience will latch onto. This is why there are so many family sitcoms, after all. Maybe you relate to Bob, working a job that does not align with his interests or values. Maybe you're like Dash, who is bored and doesn't feel challenged. Maybe you're shy like Violet and find it easier being invisible. Maybe you're like Helen and have to deal with all these dysfunctional people. There's someone here for everyone. Let's look at Mr. Incredible to start with. The film hits all of his bases right from the opening film strip and action sequence. It establishes him as a very physically strong hero with an even stronger sense of duty. They show him checking his watch, repeatedly fitting in just one more job. It establishes he likes to work alone. But most importantly, it establishes Mr. Incredible as someone who places a high value on his work. He'll eventually go to his wedding, sure, but why not both have that wedding cake and eat it? It's Helen who basically has to tell him, dude, you gotta be around now. It's especially ironic, given how earlier he jokes around about wanting to take a break and settle down. Right, sure. Pixar could have constructed this midlife crisis story for Mr. Incredible in a couple different ways. They could have simply let it be a story about a superhero that doesn't make time for his family. He's off saving the world, while Mrs. Incredible is stuck at home with the kids. Pretty basic level. But their solution is much more clever, complex, and nuanced. It's not just Bob's home life that is about to change. They bring society into it, they bring in the media, they bring in the lawsuits. They let public opinion turn against him. I'm not a particularly big fan of the execution of this moment, particularly the ridiculous lawsuit by the suicide jumper. Despite being a good cynical jab, it's a strange example to lead with, to demonstrate public opinion turning. Thankfully they have a lot of other examples, so this is a somewhat minor issue overall. We land on a status quo that is basically Bob's version of The Bad Place, a world specifically designed to torture him as much as possible. I really love the imagery they use right here. They surround this gigantic, powerful man with such a tiny and compact world. He sits in a tiny cube, he gets bossed around by a tiny man, he drives home in a tiny car. The color scheme changes from the flashy reds and blues of his past. It's now muted grays, teals, and yellows that fill his life. Fluorescent lights galore. The choice of suburbia for the setting is very fitting for these purposes. This aspect has always reminded me a little of a film like American Beauty, another story of a man feeling trapped in the suburbs. The Incredibles hits on something fundamental about certain men as they grow older. That they often get bored, they feel trapped, they need an outlet to assert themselves. Whether it be lusting for young Mina Suvari, going on secret superhero excursions, or, starting a YouTube channel. Anyway, Bob's crisis is less about him not knowing what he wants, but more about being locked out from it. He's instead forced to do his thing in secret, away from his boss and wife's prying eyes. It's only a matter of time until he explodes. Oh, by the way, Wallace Shawn's performance as his boss is just dynamite. That man can deliver an excitable diatribe like no other. Man, he's good. Anyway, the pacing of Act 1 is really nice, how they give each family member their little intro and then gradually escalate Bob's situation. Helping the little old lady transitions into a bowling night with Frozone, which transitions into wanting to stop a mugging. All the time, they're building the intrigue with this mysterious woman, and then dropping hints about the disappearance of Gazerbeam. By the time Mirage offers this mysterious job, his decision to take it and then hide it from his wife is completely earned. While it's certainly Mr. Incredible's journey, I would argue that it's Mrs. Incredible, aka Elastigirl, aka Helen Parr, who is the most important character to the narrative. Pixar smartly makes her the old reliable of the film, the character who grounds the entire thing, lays out the morals and themes, and brings the characters together. To put it in Toy Story 2 terms, she's the Buzz Lightyear. She's the major link between Bob and his kids. She's the one engaging all of their arcs. I really like how they portray her in the dinner scene, trying to engage her out-of-it husband and her unhappy and dysfunctional children. They're very careful in portraying Helen as both empathetic and smart. She's the one who has to scold Bob for staying out late, getting on his case for ignoring the family. She's the one who has to get suspicious of him and start spying on his phone calls. There's a danger in making her come off as overly naggy or mistrustful. They do a nice job here in letting Helen have her one-on-one moments with her husband, telling him that she appreciates the sacrifices he's making and that she loves him so very much. When she does become suspicious, we the audience understand why. There are certainly enough warning signs. The biggest disappointment with Helen is that they don't really explore the angle of what she gave up to become a stay-at-home mom. The beginning of the film is very clear with her interview that she wants to stay out there and save the world, but they don't follow up on this angle. Much like her husband, Helen clearly made a very difficult decision to sacrifice these goals for the good of her family. Helen does so willingly, with much less personal angst about it. And in a lot of ways, she has a much better sense of perspective than her husband. But Helen is a victim of the POV of the film, that it's Bob's character arc that drives the thing. So any discussion of Helen's personal wants and needs are not further explored. Unlike Buzz Lightyear, she didn't get an entire film explaining why she already has the answers. When Bob starts working for Mirage, we get a nice juxtaposition of home life and flashy superhero work. This is really where the gorgeous set design gets shown off in earnest. We start seeing these really big open pieces of architecture. Lots of curves, lots of moving pieces, lots of sharp contrasting colors. I especially love the look of the lava room both times we see it. The soft, quiet glow of it, the way it makes the characters look in silhouette. In terms of the visuals as a whole, The Incredibles is an important step in rendering humans for Pixar. It's getting a little less uncanny valley than the Monsters Inc. and especially Toy Story days. You can tell they're still working out some of the kinks with their texturing, as the character's skin still does look a little plasticky. They're assisted greatly by them being in rubber suits half the movie though. Did they pick a superhero movie just as an excuse to do rubber textures? I wonder. But when I think of The Incredibles, it's always the set design, the color contrast, and the action scenes I remember most. The build-up of this section is well done, especially in how it portrays Bob's progression. Here's where most of the fat jokes are. It's amusing how he huffs and puffs and gets back spasms on that first mission. This fight scene is okay, but is probably the least interesting sequence in the film. Mr. Incredible isn't 100% yet, and let's just be frank, they have a little trouble finding new things to do with his super strength by itself. Super strength is great, it's an amazing power to have, I'm not knocking his abilities. Please don't throw a car at me. It's just a challenging power to portray by itself in a visually interesting and varied way. They have to settle for a struggle and then a flip near the lava. The main thing they set up is the self-destruction thing for later. Edna Mode gets introduced around this time and plays a key factor in mitigating this Bob and Helen relationship drama. She is, of course, the absolute best, stealing every single scene that she's in. She brings in some much needed comedic levity into a fairly stressed out story. It's nice that they gave Edna the moment to pick Helen up out of her stupor, smacking her in the head and reminding her, she is Elastigirl! Gotta say that Edna designed some really nice suits here. The classic red and black look really pops. Although I do always wonder what technology keeps those masks on so well. I would totally lose mine. There is a little bit of plot convenience in the middle of Act 2, mostly done to keep things moving along. We don't get any of the backstory with Gazerbeam, like none of it, how he learned the word Chronos and found it important enough to etch into the wall. Then it ends up being the computer password. Come on, Mirage, at least do Chronos 12345, jeez. Not a huge deal logically, since getting into this room is ridiculously difficult anyway. It strikes me as them yada-yaing these details to just keep Act 2 from dragging too much. The sequence of Edna and Helen superimposed with Mr. Incredible learning the truth is executed beautifully though. The tension, the build-up, the monologue by Edna. Then we get the chaotic and frightening sequence of the cannons shooting those sticky black things. They intercut so ridiculously quickly to the cannons, the whole thing is this frenzied nightmare. Oof, that is a bad way to get captured. This is a good opportunity to finally talk about Buddy. Oh boy, Buddy. There is a lot to unpack with him. Okay, so making him the villain of this piece is brilliant. It hits on the old hero creating the villain thing that is so prevalent in comic books, but also crystallizes one of the film's central themes. The society has a tendency to tear down and erase people with exceptional abilities. There is a jealousy, a bitterness, a resentment that's created. The desire that if everyone is super, no one is. We want to take that spotlight for ourselves. It is no wonder that they named this guy Syndrome, because he is a good representative of one of society's sicknesses. There is a huge streak of cynicism that pervades The Incredibles, something that is not prevalent in most of Pixar's other work. I remember the reviewer, Confused Matthew, did a somewhat notorious video review on this film, one that has since disappeared, where he discussed the cynical nature of the film. The idea of society celebrating mediocrity and tearing down its heroes. A life insurance company that aggressively avoids helping people. Speeches in caves about guards attempting to kill children. Confused Matthew's review took more of a moral guardian stance, questioning if these darker themes are good to have in a kids' movie. I don't agree with this conclusion myself. I think the way the film presents and frames these elements is one of the most clever things about it. But it's fair to say that what Buddy represents is a much darker and more cynical spin on one of Pixar's favorite morals. In other Pixar stories, Buddy would be the protagonist. He is like Remy from Ratatouille, or Mike Wazowski in Monsters University. That character who wants to be incredible, but is told by society and mentors to get lost. He's just a kid, he's not actually super, etc. The subtext of this film can very easily be interpreted as, regular people are inherently worse and shouldn't try. Muggles can't be wizards, after all. Buddy is a nice representative of how a popular Pixar moral can poison a person. This fallen hero worship can fester inside of them. He reminds me a little bit of Lotso from Toy Story 3 in this regard. How a potential Pixar protagonist can take away the wrong moral from a similar situation, and then turn to the dark side. So from a thematic sense, Buddy is the perfect villain for the piece. He even hits on that working alone angle that Mr. Incredible struggles with. In addition, he's portrayed annoyingly enough to avoid him becoming sympathetic, avoiding some of those subtext issues. It's not that average people suck, this is just an extreme situation he's not ready for. Supervillains are not exactly playing games. The only problem with Syndrome as a villain is that they run into limitations with his lack of actual superpowers. This is a challenging thing for Pixar to deal with, considering his themes, how he can realistically fight back against such incredible power. They ended up giving him that super plasma laser thing that basically serves as a trump card. This is intentionally designed to be kind of cheap, kind of unfair. I just find it to be an unsatisfying mechanic to throw into an action scene. He either breaks the scene completely, or he's completely useless. There's no in between. He is, in my opinion, much better with the psychological torture. Also monologuing. Helen and the kids' arrival to the island sets up 3 of the darker moments in the film, all clustered together. Shooting down the jet plane, Bob's threat to snap Mirage's neck, and Helen's cave speech. There's a lot of heavy stuff in Act 2, but The Incredibles somehow manages to get away with each of them without dragging down the tone too badly. The sequence with the jet plane benefits greatly, and I mean greatly, by the fact that we, the audience, actually sees Helen escape with the kids. Can you imagine how much darker this scene would be if we didn't see it? Just Mr. Incredible hanging his head, thinking his whole family is dead. This scene is still very sad, don't get me wrong. We immediately empathize with what he's going through right here. This is heartbreaking. But the dramatic irony keeps us, the audience, from getting stuck in his head and spiraling downward with him. Later on, Syndrome literally calls out Mr. Incredible's threat as being a little too dark for him. And it is indeed very tense. But this scene is one of the key moments that unravels some of the cynicism so prevalent in the film. The cynicism is the setup, but it's obviously not the end goal. This isn't something like Batman, a tale of justice and vengeance. There is still a light within Mr. Incredible that won't betray who he is even at his darkest hour. And even if Mirage basically deserves it. When stripped of everything he has, Mr. Incredible is not like Buddy. I think it's fair to say that this is something he's still struggling with, however. I do feel like Mirage gets a little bit of a pass in the film when everything's all said and done. You feel weirdly good about her in the end, after she betrays Syndrome. The only retribution we see her get is getting deservedly punched by Helen. As a whole, she's a really cool character, really doing a nice job building up the romantic cheating subtext with her banter. It's just easy to forget how much Mirage really has to atone for in the end. Anyway, Helen's speech in the cave is, in my opinion, the most interesting decision made by Pixar for this film. In my review of The Good Dinosaur, I compared these two films' worldviews, and that they actively and repeatedly signal to the audience of how dangerous the world is. There's a similar moment in Ratatouille as well. We want this to be a fantasy, a superhero escapist story for the audience. But Helen is determined to bring us down to Earth. However, I think The Incredibles, unlike The Good Dinosaur, can get away with this more, because of the inherent agency the main characters actually have. Dash and Violet both have amazing superpowers. There is a logical sense that they can overcome their dangers. When Dash goes running off in that dizzying chase sequence, it's not creepy or sinister, despite the danger. Violet's encounter is a little more tense, mostly because she's uncertain about her powers. But, unlike a certain other film, this isn't exactly portrayed as two scared kids crying in the jungle. Agency matters. The action scenes in general are exceptionally done, a huge breakthrough for the superhero genre. The usage of CGI gives the director so many new possibilities for fight scenes. You compare the way they stage the Incredibles fights to a live-action example like 1989's Batman. There are just way more tools here. It's not a fair comparison. Today's Marvel films owe a debt to what this film achieved. Also 2002's Spider-Man, but I would argue The Incredibles more. Dash's run through the jungle is my favorite action scene in all of Pixar, and it's not really that close. It's still breathtaking even today. The music, the visuals, the fast cuts, it essentially formed the basis of what Sega tries to do for every 3D Sonic game. I love how it alternates between the wide zoomed out shots with the close-ups, how it changes the topography, and then even slows things down. It's not just a run through the jungle. This is a good point to mention Michael Giacchino's wonderful soundtrack. He put together a classic and throwbacky sound for The Incredibles' main theme, big and brassy and driving. It's fanfare and bright, like the Superman theme, but also races swiftly along, like Danny Elfman's Batman theme. Just great stuff. Anyway, back to the action again. The Incredibles loves combining superpowers together, and does an excellent job at pacing the rollout of these combos. At the beginning, we get the kids going against each other at dinner. We get Mr. Incredible working alone. Just little bursts of powers, mostly individual. Then in Act 2, they start playing with the combinations, like Helen and Dash making a boat, Dash and Violet rolling a ball through the jungle, then the entire family working together until Syndrome ruins it. I'm especially impressed with how versatile Pixar shows off Helen's abilities. Let's just be honest here. When picking superpowers for themselves, no one ever says elasticity. But Helen kinda wins me over. Just the shapes she's able to turn into, the impressive distances she's able to reach. There's a graceful agility to her movement. She's like Spider-Man and can go wherever she wants. She's very adept, much more so than her husband, at sneaking into a base. The door sequence is just great. how she's able to take out two groups of guys in separate rooms. I would argue that Violet's powers are probably the most broken, however. In a weird way, she's like the MVP of the second half with all of her force fields. She's the one who gets the family out of being captured, she gets to retrieve the remote control at the end, and she, once again, saves them all in the end, after Syndrome's plane explosion. It's clever how they give her the arc about underestimating herself and not finding her true power. If Violet is fully actualized already, Helen's stealth mission is basically moot. Just use Violet. One of the cooler little aspects of the film is the portrayal of her relationship with her mom. How Helen yells at her in the plane, Violet can't deliver, and Helen later apologizes. She was totally right to apologize, it wasn't Violet's fault. It is a little disappointing that Violet gets less screen time than the rest of her family. It's mostly a symptom of her coming-of-age story not quite vibing with Mr. Incredible's journey. Bob gets the interdependence arc, whereas Violet gets the inner strength one. They do have something in common, however, that her dad also doubts himself that he's strong enough to protect his whole family. I'm really interested in seeing what Pixar does with Violet in The Incredibles 2. There is definitely some unused potential there. Dash is a lot easier to work into the themes of the movie. He certainly feels unfulfilled at school, similar to his dad at work. Dash just wants to achieve his potential, and society isn't letting him. They build a lot of the thematic examples around him, like his desire to join the track team. Or as Bob puts it, his school's celebration of mediocrity of him graduating the 4th grade. There is definitely a bit of fist shaking at millennials in this film, the tired cliche of everyone getting a trophy. Their happy medium of Dash shooting for second place in the end is very funny. His relationship arc with his sister is pretty standard, let's not lie to ourselves, but the superpowers keeps it pretty fresh. I think a lot of people can identify with his furious, "stay away from my sister" moment. These two make a good team. The final battle with the Omnidroid comes together well, taking advantage of the various combinations of the Incredibles' powers. Love the callback to Bob throwing the football to Dash. This time they add Frozone to the mix, that extra wrinkle the climax needs. I really like the character of Frozone as a whole, he serves the best friend role very well, and Samuel L. Jackson, of course, delivers a phenomenal voice performance here. The "where is my super suit" scene is a classic. The only issue with Frozone is that he literally disappears for half of the movie, which is super disappointing for me. I get it, I get that they need to focus on the family stuff on the island, that's really what the movie is about. I just wish there was a way to keep him in the picture a little more. He gets stuck riding the bench for way too long. Syndrome's ultimate scheme is fun, although it does make the climax kind of strange. Love how much bravado and how scripted it is when he's fighting the evil robot. Love how he's undone by his robot learning a little too much for its own good. Everything flows nicely. You can tell that Pixar had a little trouble dealing with his lack of powers here again, as he basically goes out like a chump. They instead go with the Jack-Jack abduction at the very end for the final showdown. It's kind of a weird ending in some ways, almost like the main villain is some loose end they gotta wrap up. Oh yeah, almost forgot about that guy. They execute the moment well, however, especially seeing Jack-Jack's powers for the first time. What is up with that kid? And then a beautiful payoff to the joke about no capes. Absolutely perfect. Kind of a grisly death for a Pixar movie if you can visualize it, but still, absolutely perfect. We even get a funny little payoff of the kid on the street. Nice. The Incredibles ends up being this oddly character-driven film, and I think that's why it resonates so much for people. It's not centered around some magical MacGuffin of great power that everyone wants or fears. It's not based around some guy wanting to take over or destroy the world. Everything ends up happening because some dude had a gigantic chip on his shoulder and demanded to be seen as incredible. Building a gigantic company with incredible tech isn't enough for him. It's a film that says a lot about human nature, whether it be societal stuff and the way we treat those with talent, or whether it be the interpersonal family stuff and not taking each other for granted. Bob ends up learning a very familiar and predictable moral about family and togetherness, but it ends up feeling fresh anyway thanks to that magical lens of superheroism. How can someone learn to appreciate and depend on others when they can already bench press a train? The director Brad Bird previously worked on The Simpsons, and you can certainly see some of that DNA in its worldview. The Incredibles doesn't run away from family dysfunction or how cynical the world can be. It runs directly toward it. It respects the audience enough to portray it with brutal honesty. And it knows that it can afford to be a little dark sometimes. The superhero genre is inherently full of this hope and optimism that the characters can overcome their challenges. There's an underlying sense that they can do it. They can still save the day. They have the tools. We're like that kid on the sidewalk. What are we waiting for? Something amazing, I guess. And it's just incredibly fun. Superheroes are fun. That's the important thing. If the upcoming sequel can somehow manage to be as fun and action-packed as this one, well, I suppose that would be pretty good. I'm done monologuing now. Thanks for watching.